Good morning, everyone. Good seeing you all this morning. So on the second Sabbath, we are going through the book of Ruth, that short, sweet, and rich biblical narrative. Just a recap, there are three main characters in the book. Naomi, an Israelite who returned to her hometown, Bethlehem, after losing her husband and two sons in a foreign land. Ruth, a foreigner, one of Naomi's daughter-in-law, who resolved to live with and for her mother-in-law till death do them apart. And Boaz, a pious Israelite and an extravagant giver, whose field Ruth stumbled upon as she was seeking for the day's ration, who happened to be a relative of Naomi's late husband. So these were the three characters. Right? And previously we saw Ruth, in accordance with her mother-in-law's instruction, making a bold, if not reckless, approach to Boaz and making an appeal that he spreads his wings over her since he was a redeemer. This entire scene was set in a nightly threshing floor with just the two of them, quite murky and dubious, full of potentials to go awry. But both Ruth and Boaz acted civil, if I may put it that, showing respect to each other and to God. And they had a conversation which had a happy and yet a bit unsatisfying ending. Happy in that Ruth was promised to be redeemed, but unsatisfying in that the Redeemer could be Boaz or someone else who hasn't even appeared in this book. So with both the certainty of redemption and uncertainty of the how or by whom, Ruth lied down on the threshing floor. And there we'll pick it up this morning. So Ruth chapter 3 verse 14 reads, "So she, Ruth, lay at his feet, at Boaz's feet, until the morning, but arose before one could recognize one another." And I'm just wondering if she was even able to sleep that night, right? And at the break of the dawn, maybe bright enough to walk safely to home, but not enough to recognize each other's face, Ruth got up. And around the same time, Boaz, said, "Let it not be known that the woman came to the threshing floor." Now, apparently, Boaz was not speaking to Ruth, right? I mean, it would have been weird for him to address her as the woman. Right? Most likely, he was addressing himself. Or in other words, he thought to himself, it shouldn't be known to anyone else that the woman, Ruth, came to the threshing floor. And this is actually quite unique in this book because, as you might have noticed by now, the narrator of Ruth doesn't really give us many insights into the character's inner thoughts, emotions, motivations, or intentions, right? They just speak and act, and it's up to the readers, us, to infer what's behind their words and actions. So we, as readers, could take, for example, their deeds of kindness at face value, or maybe as driven by hidden motives, right? So there's some mystery in regards to what's actually going on in their minds or hearts, which I think makes this book interesting. But here, as a rare instance, the inner thought of this man is exposed, right? Whether he said it out to himself or not, he deemed it better to dismiss the woman, Ruth, secretly. Why? Well, that's not written. Right? But we may surmise that Boaz perhaps wanted to avoid any suspicion about his and Ruth's relationship. Right? Both had a reputation to preserve. Because, I mean, these two people were so different from each other, right? An Israelite and a Moabite, a man and woman, an older person and a younger person, rich and poor, single and widowed, landowner and a scavenger, right? So they were so different, but they shared at least one thing, and that was their character. Right? Remember how both were characterized in this book. Boaz was a worthy man, and Ruth a worthy woman, as the townspeople acknowledged her. So if Ruth was seen departing from Boaz's heap of grain in the morning, all sorts of speculations may have arisen, none of which would have been good for either of them. Therefore, Boaz, and it seems Ruth also, determined it better for her to leave unnoticed. Right? And you see, worthy people know that doing the right thing is not enough. Right? The thing needs to be done right, if that makes sense. Right? And neither Boaz nor Ruth did anything wrong that night, apparently. And they could have cared less about what people would think of them. They could have insisted, well, we didn't do anything wrong, and that's the fact. If you have a problem with it, it's your problem, not ours. They could have said that. And sometimes we do take that kind of a stance, don't we? Saying, here's the truth, I said it, it's up to you now. Right? Because we sometimes assume that having the truth comes with the right to present it any way we want. And as we've done our job, it's up to the other end, right? But maybe not, right? Worthy people, I think, know what Jesus meant when he said that his disciples were to be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. Worthy people know when and when not to cause a scene. So Ruth and Boaz here thought, well, we didn't do anything wrong, but I guess we should go separate ways in secret. Well, I think that's enough moralization, so let's get back to the text. Boaz said, "Bring the garment you are wearing and hold it out." And this was probably different from, if you remember, the cloak that Ruth put on herself earlier. This garment must have been sturdy enough to hold, well, what was to come next. So she held it, and he measured out 6 measures of barley and put it on her. Now, many commentators provided with an extensive discussion on what measurement was used. Right? That is 6 what? Which I have not much of an interest. I personally think the exact amount is irrelevant here, which is why I think the narrator didn't spell it out in the first place. But I think the importance here is the act of giving the barley. Right? Maybe with his own hands, Boaz scooped the freshly winnowed barley and poured it in the garment Ruth held out. And this he did 6 times. Right? And we wonder, what was the significance? Why did he do that? Was Boaz simply concerned about Ruth and Naomi not having enough to eat? Or did Boaz want to share with them the fruit of the harvest? Or was Boaz a bit Japanese in that he couldn't let Ruth live without an omiyage for her and potentially his soon-to-be mother-in-law? Was this to be a sort of a bride price even, or a guarantee that he will surely resolve the matter? Or in the light of his concern about people speculating about their nightly encounter, was this meant to be a device for an excuse? So if in the case that Ruth is found by someone, she could have said, well, we didn't have anything to eat, so I went to Boaz to get some food. Right? I don't know how convincing that argument might have been, but right? In any case, whatever the reason or motivation was, Boaz must have thought it important enough to give her 6 measures of barley instead of sending her off as quickly and as lightly as possible. Right? Possibly because of, but I think in spite of, the expressed concerns we saw earlier, Boaz took this time to gift Ruth and Naomi the barley, which for me is another indication of his excessive generosity. Right? And then she, or depending on the translation you might have, which is depending on the manuscript that the translation used to translate, might have he, went into the city. The story flows more naturally when read as a she, I think. It was Ruth who was preparing to leave and, having received the barley, headed back to her mother-in-law. But Boaz also had to return to the city at some point, right? not only to take care of his business, but the business entrusted to him. So it's possible, I suppose, to read it as a he, him going to the city. Right? Either way, the night was over and they parted. And when Ruth, came to her mother-in-law, she said, "How did you fare, my daughter?" Now, if Boaz and Ruth had spent a sleepless night, the same would have been the case for Naomi, the mastermind behind this daring mission which Ruth had just carried out. Then she told her all that the man had done for her, saying, "These 6 measures of barley he gave to me. For he said to me, 'You must not go back empty-handed to your mother-in-law.'" Now, what's interesting here is what the narrator of this book left out. The narrator didn't recite word to word what Ruth told her mother-in-law. Whatever happened during that night, including the conversation we read in this book, is abstracted and abbreviated by this narration. She told her all that the man had done. Right? So we don't exactly know what that all involved. The night forever remains shrouded in mystery for us readers. Right? But one thing the narrator did write out as coming out of the mouth of Ruth is this: "These 6 measures of barley he gave to me, for he said to me, 'You must not go back empty-handed to your mother-in-law.'" Whether Boaz actually said it or not, we cannot tell. Ruth could have made this up, or we can take her at her words. But if Boaz, did say this, I think the narrator has done a marvelous job not recording it earlier when Boaz was speaking, but instead having Ruth say these words. Well, why I say that? Well, the mention of emptiness isn't new in this book. This, in fact, is the second time. Right? So when was the first appearance? Well, it was when Ruth and Naomi came back to Bethlehem. When the people were surprised to see them, or maybe more specifically Naomi, they said, "Is this Naomi? Is this really her?" Right? To which she replied, "Do not call me Naomi," which means pleasant, "but call me Mara," which means bitter, "for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back" what? "Empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has testified against me and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me?" The reason why Naomi, moved to Moab was because she and her family was struggling with famine back then. Right? That is, their pantry became empty. But then when she returned to Bethlehem, she was emptied of her family. Right? She'd lost her husband, her 2 sons, and a daughter-in-law, which she wished luck. Right? And all this Naomi attributed to God as its cause. Right? Naomi just didn't happen to become empty. "The Lord has brought me back empty," Naomi said. Right? And when we consider this text in the earlier sermon, I think it was the 3rd installation in this series, we wondered whether what Naomi's saying was actually the case. That is, whether the Lord did do these things to her, really. Right? And the conclusion I drew was that we cannot really answer definitively either way. Right? And we took it as a case of how difficult and, at the end of the day, uncertain our understanding of how God works in our lives, right? Which I think is why we're called to faith and not indisputable facts. Right? Whether the Lord did deal very bitterly with Naomi, brought her back empty, testified against her, and brought calamity upon her are up to discussion, which, by the way, should never lead us to take lightly or deny Naomi's experience or her interpretation of the event or the witness she bore. Yet one thing we may point out, as we did in this earlier sermon, is the undeniable presence of Ruth. However empty or emptied Naomi might have become, and however lonely she might have felt, the fact was that there was not a single moment when she was truly alone. Ruth was there at her side all along. Although Naomi did return empty in the sense of losing her family members, she did actually come back with a new family member. Because Ruth herself promised, and this is a surprising statement, but she promised not to her late husband, but to Naomi, her mother-in-law, where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you. I don't know, but I think having this kind of a daughter-in-law is rare. I don't know if you want it or not, but. And however insignificant Naomi might have thought of her childless Moabite daughter-in-law, there she was by her side at her lowest of lowest, emptiest of emptiest. And so, this I quoted in the earlier sermon, but Old Testament scholar Campbell notes that with playfulness and delicious irony, the first chapter of this book closed with Naomi complaining about her emptiness, while Ruth, the very person who will bring about an end to Naomi's emptiness, stand there, apparently unnoticed. So the irony is that the one who was unnoticed, even dismissed as making no difference to the emptiness from which Naomi was suffering, was now claiming that she didn't return empty. The one who stood there listening to the lament of emptiness, while Ruth did sacrifice everything to give, now came home with barley. Because someone thought that she must not go back empty-handed to Naomi, who lamented of her emptiness. So as Younger points out, by putting the phrase on the lips of Ruth rather than on the lips of Boaz in the previous scene, there is a rich irony, since it was Ruth who heard the word used for the first time by Naomi as an expression of her deep despair, even though Ruth was present and already foreshadowed Naomi's relief. So at one level, this was the high point of Naomi's fortune being reversed. She was no longer empty. She was no longer to be emptied by virtue of Boaz, who deemed that she must not be empty, and perhaps most importantly, Ruth, who made that all possible, or who actualized that possibility that there was. But then at another level, this might make us wonder, was Naomi ever really empty? I mean, experientially, no doubt, right? She must have experienced an utter emptiness. Right? But then, could it be that, as Bush wrote, it is a subtle and sensitive touch of our narrator that these words of Boaz explaining the gift, which is his pledge that Naomi's emptiness is over, are placed in the mouth of Ruth, who not only heard it from the depths of Naomi's despair, but whose very presence there with Naomi, ignored and unacknowledged in the blindness of her bitterness, was clear evidence that her emptiness, even then, even when they came back, even when Naomi pronounced of her emptiness, was to some extent illusory and most certainly temporary. Or in other words, could it be that God had not brought Naomi back completely empty, but that she had Ruth? And this, I hope, would make us wonder for ourselves too. And that is that when we feel lost, even perhaps forsaken by God, when we feel empty, even emptied by God Himself, could it be that some or even many years later, we might be able to look back and say, you know what? I was never completely lost or completely empty. Could that be the case? Maybe. Or at least we hope that that could be the case. And this hope, while it won't in any way do away with the sense of loss and emptiness we sometimes feel and experience, it might give us the needed patience and endurance to keep us going for at least another day. With this sense, with this hope that maybe not everything is lost. Because it may be that we're simply blinded by our tears, being unable to recognize the presence of someone, maybe a capital someone, who might be able to fill our emptiness. Or who has, by his or her presence, already hindered us from being completely empty. And for us to see that, for us to realize that, we might need some patience and endurance. So there's a conundrum, the question of the chicken or the egg. Patience and endurance keep our hope alive, while hope keep our patience and endurance alive. Whichever comes first, they're bound up together, I think. And one more day of perseverance may give us another disappointment. Or by faith we believe, or we'd like to believe, hope. So Naomi replied, "Wait, my daughter, until you learn how the matter turns out. For the man will not rest, but will settle the matter today." So what they could do, they did. Their roles were complete. And in fact, this conversation turns out to be the last words spoken by both Ruth and Naomi. All they could and were to do now was to wait or sit still, as King James Version has it. And as is often the case in our lives also, beyond a certain point, and it's sometimes difficult to determine that certain point, but beyond a certain point, we have to let go of our grip, of our control, to sit still and wait, which is very difficult sometimes, right? Which calls for our trust in the goodwill of the other people, or maybe the capital other, God, that the matter will be settled for the good. And this isn't always easy to do, but that's sometimes what we are called to do, or that's something we can only do. And I think as readers of this story, we too are invited to do so, as the narrator of the book once again leaves us hanging. And I, as a preacher, leave us hanging till next month. So the question remains, will the man really not rest until he settles the matter, as Naomi thought? Will the man, Boaz, be the redeemer, or someone else unnamed take this place? And will the unrest of this man, Boaz, finally give Ruth her well-deserved rest? Well, for today, let's wait and see how the matter will fall, and hopefully fall into place. Let's close with a word of prayer. Our Father in heaven, we thank you for this gathering, for this time to worship you, and for this time to listen to your word, to be touched by it. And it is our prayer that these words may stay within our hearts, that these words will continue to teach us. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.